Okay, we are recording and we are ready to go.
All right. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Missoula Fire Lab seminar as we continue our series about the wildfire crisis strategy. Today, we are pleased to have with us James Meldrum. James is a research economist with the U.S. Geological Survey, based out of the Fort Collins Science Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. He is a founding member of the wildfire research also known as WIRE collaboration between wildfire mitigation practitioners and social science researchers. He has published numerous journal articles through that effort. In addition, James investigates natural resource decisions in numerous contexts, including fuels and fire management, ecosystem restoration, electricity generation, and the management of invasive species. Today James is going to be talking to us about how an evidence-based approach to community-focused wildfire education programs can put people at the center of wildfire solutions. So with that, please welcome James Meldrum. And if you have any questions during this presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat and James will address them at the end of the presentation. So James, over to you.
Great. Thank you. And just let me know if nothing's coming through. Otherwise, I'll assume it is. So thank you to the Fire Lab for the opportunity to talk today and for everybody who is able to listen in. So I'm James Meldrum, and I'm talking on behalf of the Wildfire Research, or WIRE team, including my colleague, Hannah Brinkert-Smith, who had been listed as co-presenting on the announcement for this webinar today. We all work closely together, and Hannah and I decided to streamline things just by having me present. So I apologize that you'll have to listen to my voice instead of Hannah's today, but I do believe she's still on the phone to join in the Q&A at the end if she wants. So I want to start off by first acknowledging significant support from the Forest Service and the Rocky Mountain Research Station, as well as numerous other institutions, including or organizations, including Joint Fire Science Program, National Science Foundation, all of our home institutions, and very much all of our partners in these projects. And I'll be talking about the partners more in a few minutes. So my talk today is intended to build on Eva and Kelly's webinar from last week. And I want to thank Eva in particular for the great conceptual introduction about multiple pathways to risk reduction, drawing from the work of Matt Thompson, Dave Calkin, and others. So I'm giving this talk from a hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Apologies if you hear the air conditioner kicking in or the heater kicking in. But I'm here visiting to present results from a recent WIRE project with the City of Santa Fe Fire Department to numerous interested groups. So I thought I'd start by showing 3 different assessments covering the communities that make up the study area for that project. In all 3, darker reds represent higher risks in the different assessments. So first, we have the Wildfire Risk Communities map, which is what Eva and Kelly were focusing on last week. Next, we have the Community Hazard Rating map developed by a contractor for Santa Fe back in 2006 using fire hazard mapping and some community level characteristics. Then we have the parcel level risk assessment from the WIRE project with the City of Santa Fe. The pie charts on the graph on the right show the distribution of parcel level ratings within each of 8 studied communities. These each have between 40 and about 200 homes in each of these communities. So I first want to highlight the communities going up towards the peak of this mountain here. So all 3 assessments here suggest that these communities should be of pretty high concern due to wildfire risks. But in contrast, if you compare these 2 communities, you might get conflicting signals of priority across the different tools. So the lower community, Arroyo Camizo, is rated relatively low risk in the 2 broader scale assessments, yet more than half of the properties in that community were assessed as high risk in the parcel level risk assessment. In contrast, the upper community, Monte Sereno, is rated pretty high in the 2 assessments on the left, yet the majority of the homes there were rated low or moderate risk in the parcel level assessment. So I wanted to start with this example to emphasize, just as Eva and Kelly did, that this is not a case where there is or even should be one tool to rule them all, but rather different tools for different purposes. This doesn't mean that either assessment is wrong, but rather they just provide unique information. So I want to provide one more example from another project just to show I'm not cherry picking a specific case here. So this time we're in Genesee, Colorado, which is a community south of I-70 as it heads west from Denver up into the mountains. So wildfire risk to communities product notes this community as having very high risk to homes, with risk lower in the northeast section and increasing to the southwest. This is important information for informing decision-making at higher levels and likely reflects the role of the wide highway there, as serving as both a fuel break and providing access. However, not reflected in that map is the variation within the fire protection district in terms of property level characteristics. So we know from the rapid assessments conducted there that the homes near the highway include many densely situated duplexes and triplexes with high home-to-home ignition potential. We also have many of the homes in the highlighted area have limited egress options, very little defensible space, and combustible roof and siding materials. Overall, these factors combine into many homes in the highlighted area being assigned very high or even extreme overall risk in the parcel level assessment. So if you watched Eva's presentation, you might remember her noting that the wildfire risk communities modeling assumes a generalized susceptibility across all homes in the nation. The WIRI rapid assessment helps pick up where that leaves off. And our broader WIRI project is built around trying to understand how to move from this type of information to informing local programs that lead to more homes being properly mitigated and prepared for wildfire. So I've already mentioned WIRI a few times, and it was mentioned in the introduction, so you might be wondering what that really is. So we're a cross-institution team that focuses on the interface between local risk mitigation and education programs and the residents those programs are intended to serve. We use a co-production model for conducting actionable social science, built on the belief that mitigation on private land and preparedness of community residents are essential to creating fire-adapted communities. We're a growing cast of characters at federal agencies, the University of Colorado in Boulder, and the nonprofit Wildfire Research Center, with a mix of fire mitigation, applied social science, and related areas of expertise. So I'm the one talking today, but it really is a very integrated effort, deeply supported by all the individuals on this slide. In addition, every one of our projects involves close collaboration with a partner who is focused on wildfire risk mitigation on private property. Our partners include numerous local, regional, state, or nonprofit organizations. Often fire departments are either primary or secondary partners, but regardless, it is essential that the WIRI project has the full buy-in of a local partner. So we got our start working in a few locations in Colorado, which is where the majority of our team is based. But as our team and capacity has grown, we focused more on scaling out rather than scaling up. We now have studies in 7 Western states, and we maintain active relationships with many past partners, as well as continue to develop new partnerships in new locations, because our mission is to support evidence-based community wildfire mitigation and education efforts so that communities can live with wildfire. And that really requires this place-based, focused effort. So the centerpiece of the objective for the whole project really is for the homes to ultimately be properly mitigated and prepared. And our partners pursue this objective by a variety of different programs. They run things like chipper days or grants or community meetings. They provide information. They run emergency notifications and signups, all different programs aimed at increasing the preparedness of residents in the communities where they work for the potential for wildfire. So these efforts are often informed by landscape level wildfire risk assessments, like what we were hearing about with the wildfire risk communities. And these show the distribution of hazard primarily between communities. One of the sources of data that we work on in our projects is the WIRI parcel level risk assessments. And this is what I was showing on the first slides on the right graphic. And these are really created to show the distribution of risk within a community. WIRI projects pair these with household surveys. These household surveys go out to the residents living in these properties so that they become paired data that match what professional assessors see when they look at a property with how the people living on those properties think about their wildfire risks. Not only the specific characteristics that were included in the assessment, but also things like their information sources, incentives, things that would interact with the decision-making that they're doing. And so because this is a co-productive effort that involves a lot of researchers, we also layer numerous research questions over all the different aspects of this. So I'm not going to focus on these, but this is part of an integrated part of our entire effort, is thinking about these research questions and how they interplay and can ultimately inform the work being done on the ground. So the two things to note about this process from a data perspective that I think make it relatively unique. First, the WIRI surveys have generally pretty high response rates, something in the mid-40s, 45% or so being pretty typical. And if you're familiar with survey research, this is pretty high compared to a lot of work that goes out these days. And we attribute these really to both using a careful systematic process that follows best social science practices, and that includes doing things like still using mailed paper surveys in most cases. But also the surveys do not come from the university or the federal agency, but they come from the local partner. And the letters that introduce the survey come from the local partner, including often the area's fire chief. So there's that tie-in to the local area. This is a local effort and it's informing the programs in the area. Second, because the surveys are matched properties, or matching with the rapid assessments, we can actually evaluate whether respondents are representative in terms of the assessed risks, parcel level risks. And indeed, we find that the distribution of overall parcel level risk scores do not, across our studies, do not differ meaningfully between survey respondents and all rapid assessments. So I'm showing here the aggregated results across all of our different studies. And you can see the two distributions match up very well. If anything, properties with low or moderate overall rapid risk assessment ratings are actually slightly underrepresented compared to properties with higher or very high risk ratings. So now I'd like to provide an overview of the types of information that this type of paired data set can provide, and how this can be used to support action to reduce wildfire risk across different scales. First, the data can provide a snapshot of the risk profile across different parcels within a community. So this risk profile is developed through the Rapid Parcel Level Wildfire Risk Assessment, or what we call the RA for short, which is conducted for all homes within selected study communities. The RA differs from an in-depth property walkthrough, which would typically involve hours of staff time working with an individual, homeowner, or a resident to understand their risk factors in detail. Instead, the RA has been developed iteratively with many partners over time to address broad categories of wildfire risk at a parcel level, provide actionable information at a high level, so reflecting back to the categories, actionable information that relates to that, and really to prioritize coverage and speed. So these assessments are designed to take about 30 seconds per property or 60 seconds per property, with the idea that entire communities can be looked at the same time by the same individuals. And this provides this snapshot of the distribution of risk across the neighborhood. So the RA looks at 4 main categories with relative weights assigned to reflect their contribution to overall risk. So the predominant contributor to the overall risk score comes from the home ignition potential, with major factors coming from the roof and siding material. Also, whether they're combustible attachments, things like porches or roofs, or even porches or fences that are attached to the structure made of combustible materials. And then the distance to adjacent homes plays a large role, and that's also part of what we consider the home ignition potential within this. We also look at defensible space, so the distance to overgrown, dense, or unmanaged vegetation, as well as distance to other combustibles, and that's about nearly 20% of the overall risk score. Background conditions do play a role, and these are things that are not necessarily under the control of the homeowner, but they often, or at least on the short time scale, or meaningful reasonable amount of cost, but these are things that still contribute to that parcel level variation in risk. Things like distance to dangerous topography, drainages, roofs, chimneys, things like that. The average slope of the property near the structure. And then a characterization of the density of the adjacent fuels outside of that defensible space zone. And finally, the fourth broad category is access characteristics, and these are things that are related both to the evacuation potential of homeowners getting out in the event of a wildfire, and also, of course, access for suppression and getting engines in to safely be able to work on the fire on those properties. And so then once all those individual attributes are assessed, they can be summed into an overall risk score, but really we often try to focus as much as we can on the individual attributes, because that's where a lot of the meaningful information comes from. So as I was just saying, one main purpose of the RA data is helping to identify specific aspects of wildfire risk and how they might be distributed across a study area. So for example, and I'm pulling this example from the Santa Fe work because it's fresh on my mind. Like I said, I'm here right now working on this project, so everything's fresh. But an important point with that is that some of the general overall lessons apply when you move from place to place, things like the variation between communities and other things I'll be highlighting. But a lot of the specific details differ in very important ways. And I'll be showing that with data, but I just want to kind of lead with that important caveat because I don't want people scribbling down notes and then saying, well, this is what they found in Santa Fe, so they're saying that this is everywhere. That's very much not what we're saying here. And so the example here is 61% of the assessed properties within the Santa Fe study have only one road in or out of their community. 67% of respondents thought this was the case, which is relatively close. But the thing is that 61% average doesn't really mean much once you start looking at it, breaking it apart by communities. And when you break it apart to see the community level results, you have much more actionable information. Here we see between anywhere 6 or 100% of the properties in these different study communities have only one road in or out, which obviously is a major concern when you're thinking about evacuation and also what could potentially be done for suppression in wildfire. And so you can see this distribution. This is very wide distribution, and this is the type of information that we work on after the RA. We package the information and try to work with a local partner to really understand what does this mean in terms of their prioritization in different places and the different programs that might need to be tailored for the different areas. And so just some more examples from the Santa Fe study. Again, these differences across communities highlight specific needs. So overall, within the study area, 82% of the properties have less than 30 feet to combustible items, things like deck furniture, hay bales, propane tank. So this isn't the vegetation defensible space, but it's anything else near the structure that could capture embers and then transfer flames into the structure. And we see some variation across the communities for sure, but that 82% provides a relatively good measure across the different places. Another area of particular concern for the local partner, the Santa Fe Fire Department, is the combustible fences. The coyote fences, which are essentially timber spread out in a fence form, or kindling spread out in a fence form, are pretty common here. It's a common part of the architectural style and historical character of the area. 41% of the properties that were in the rapid assessment have these types of combustible fences attached to their structures. And you can see if you look at the map, the numbers vary quite a bit across the different communities. One of the newer communities in the Northwest is only 3%, where some of the older communities, more historical structures, are more than 50% of the properties have these. So again, it changes the focus of when our partners go into these different communities, what they need to focus on, what they need to be thinking about in terms of the areas of risk, and also the things they want to encourage homeowners to make a change on. And then finally, 18% overall have an address sign that does not meet the safety standards of being reflective and visible in the expected low visibility environment of a fire. But again, you see that large variation across different communities, anywhere from about 9% of the properties to 47% of the properties. So shifting gears a little bit, and we're no longer talking about Santa Fe here, but one other point about the rapid assessment data is that these data are collected in the course categories that I've shown, about 12 categories, with each attribute measured in between 2 and 4 different levels per attribute. So even though this RA is built on the best fire science available, paired with expert experience and information, a fair question is how meaningful this information really is, given this coarse measurement. Does it actually reflect any sort of differences in risk to the homes? And so we unfortunately had the opportunity to test this question after the 2020 East Troublesome Fire, which ran through one of our communities included in a WIRI project with Grand County Wildfire Council in Colorado. So there, the community of Columbine Lake saw 26 out of 461 assessed homes destroyed in this fire. And so when we look at the distribution of overall risk scores, so the weighted sum of all those different attributes for this community, we clearly see that overall risk was generally higher for the destroyed homes than the homes that were not destroyed. The distributions do overlap substantially. So that are not accounted for in the RA. And that's to be expected, given that it's just a quick look at a small set of factors on a property. but still the signal is meaningful. There's a significant difference between the overall risk score for the homes that were destroyed versus the homes that were not destroyed. But what I think is even more important than that, we analyzed the 12 individual attributes that were measured in the RA using models that accounted for the spatial interactions among properties. And with this approach, we found that the home's risky rating increased the chance that its neighbors burned down, and vice versa, for 8 of the 12 attributes. So in addition to providing a real-world test of the RA data, this result underscores the importance of thinking about individual homes not only as recipients of fire risk, but also as potential sources of risk for their neighbor. And the characteristics of each individual home can be influencing the risk of their neighboring properties. So with that in mind, I'd like to shift gears again to talk about how the individual level data can support action at the local landscape scale by providing information about residents' perceptions of fuel treatment approaches. So the typical surveys ask numerous batteries of questions about residents' perceptions of wildfire risks and what can be done about them. One set of questions added to more recent surveys looks at the acceptability of land treatments on nearby public lands. And so we're showing here kind of a compilation of the average result across, I think it's either 8 or 9 different studies. Each color of dot represents the percentage of respondents within a given study who found the listed treatment action as very or extremely acceptable. The averages, shown in black and with numbers, tell one story. And we see that removing trees and vegetation is generally found more acceptable, or is found acceptable by more respondents in the study area than the different types of fire. Prescribed fire coming in generally low, with about 57% of respondents in these study areas overall. But the important point that I want to underscore here is that the spread, particularly for prescribed fire, is quite substantial. Depending on which community you're talking about, which study area you're talking about, anywhere from 30% to 75% of the respondents in that place find prescribed fire as being very acceptable. And of course, we know that there's a lot of different things that could go into this. It could be the local culture, it could be their recent experiences with fire, including prescribed fire, it could be their understanding of the local ecology. But the important point is these are different studies, and you can see in the red, the dots are reflecting some of the places coming from that map. When you move from place to place, the result changes quite substantially, including not just a kind of a nuanced statistical significant difference, but a true meaningful difference. 30% versus 75% really is going to change the conversations that happen in that community and whether it's something that is even appropriate for that community or not. And so one other point here, and this is tying it back to the thinking about the individual level, is that coming from these same surveys, the average response or the average agreement with a statement saying, I am not willing to remove trees on my own property to reduce wildfire risk is 6%. And so if you compare that against the 77%, or the inverse being 23% who are against removing trees and vegetation or don't find it acceptable on the public lands, we actually find a higher level of acceptability of doing the mitigation work on people's own property. 6% is not a very large proportion of the populations that we're looking at. And so again, I want to just look at the Santa Fe example, just to demonstrate how this can vary within the communities of study area. So the census style approach of surveying every single assessed home within each study community allows us to dissect the data deeper, even when we're working in communities with, say, 40 homes. So focusing on this Santa Fe study, we see between 66 and 92% of a community's respondents rated removing trees or reducing other vegetation on nearby public lands as very or extremely acceptable. And so again, this type of nuanced information is really actionable and useful for the local partners. It changes the conversations that they can have. It also changes where it might be appropriate for the local communities to be doing different types of actions. Maybe they need to be thinking about alternative pathways to reducing risk in some places where there's less acceptability, less reported acceptability of different things. Again, many different ways to interpret the data, but these are the types of things that come through in the conversations and the importance of having the local partners involved in this type of work. The data become much more meaningful in that context. And similarly, we see variation in the acceptance of prescribed fire. Between 52 and 74% of the community's respondents rated conducting prescribed fire on nearby public lands as either very or extremely acceptable. It should be noted that these survey data were collected before the Hermit's Peak fire last year, which was an escape prescribed fire not too far from Santa Fe. And so it's certainly possible that some of these perceptions have changed, but the way that we're currently thinking about this is, yes, we want to learn about how things may have changed based on those local conditions, but this also kind of provides the baseline condition that people can be working to get back to. This is what people were saying was acceptable before there might have been a triggering event that kind of changes some of the conversations. But this is kind of a baseline that might be something that the local partners can work toward, hopefully getting back to that higher levels of acceptability of prescribed fire. And again, that's very speculative because we haven't conducted the survey. We don't know if attitudes have actually changed within this area. But then finally, our team investigates potential influences on the parcel level decisions of homeowners in fire-prone communities. And so this is where the detailed survey data for individual property owners or residents becomes very useful, as well as having the individual information from the rapid assessments from each property. And so one thing that we find, and again, I'm just rolling with the Santa Fe data here, but this is something that is relatively common across different study areas, is that residents will often report actively reducing their wildfire risk if you ask them, have you taken these actions? So there's high levels of people reporting having reduced vegetation, regularly clearing their roof and gutters, and regular mowing and raking around the residence. And these are all framed specifically in terms of, are you taking these actions to reduce wildfire risk? We see in this community about half of people report having hardened their home in some way, and also of a pretty high level of engagement of about a third of people have met with a wildfire professional to evaluate their home risk. So clearly it's the engaged community that is thinking about it, they're working on it, they're doing things. But one of the advantages of pairing this to the rapid assessment data is that we can kind of assess how well that matches up with the way a professional views the property. And this is something that is a very common result that we see. The professional ratings show that there's a fair amount more work that can be done on these properties. So the top line here is the result from the rapid assessment. So that's what the professionals coming from the fire department going out and looking at the properties, how they assessed it. And more than 90% of the properties, they assessed fewer than 30% or 30 feet of defensible space. Using the same measures in a short description in the household survey, respondents, only about 30% of respondents rated themselves as having less than 30 feet. So clearly there's a disconnect between the way that people are seeing their properties and the way the professional does. And it's really important that we have this information because we don't want to be able to, or we don't want to have to just rely on that self-report because it seems to be over-reporting if we want to be talking about outcomes. But we also want to know what the homeowners are doing, the work that they're doing. You know, we don't think that 90% of people are lying about having done work managing their vegetation. It's the way that we interpret this is much more about what it means to have that vegetation managed. There's a lot of interpretation involved with defensible space. And so with this type of information, this can inform the local partner. These are the conversations that we need to have. This is a specific area of learning where we can hopefully work with the residents, especially because the residents are interested and they're engaged with the problem. And so this is the type of information that can then hopefully move the needle to getting more homes mitigated and prepared for wildfire. So how do we work with partners to help develop programs to decrease these gaps? One way is by including survey questions that ask about incentives or things that residents say would encourage them to do more mitigation on their work. So again, sticking with the Santa Fe example, here we found that about half of respondents noted the top 3 incentives that would encourage them to do mitigation on their own lands. About half of respondents noted these. And so one-on-one visit with wildfire risk experts on my community, on my property, a report describing my property's risk factors, and help doing the work. And the top 2 of these relate exactly back to this thing of it's not that people don't know that they're at risk. They don't want to just be told you're at risk, you need to do something. It's that they recognize a need for having more specific information provided by a local professional that can really guide them towards the specific actions that can be most effective on their own properties. Moving forward, we also see about a third of respondents reported the next three things, which could be feedback on work that they've already done to reduce the property's risk, a list of recommended contractors, and a neighborhood group that organizes wildfire risk reduction activities. And the final data point here is that only 1 out of 10 of respondents here state that recognition for taking action, something like a yard sign or maybe notice on a public website or something like that, would encourage them to conduct mitigation on their property. And this low level of interest in that type of recognition is pretty common across studies. And this type of information is really interesting, particularly for someone like me. I come from the field of economics, and we've done some studies, and I'll be talking about them in a little bit, about like behavioral economics. And there people talk a lot about trying to think about gamifying and how can we use this type of external facing work, these external facing notices or things like that to try to encourage actions. And what we see when we ask the residents is pretty consistently that that type of information is not really what they're looking for. But it's also much more consistent that we see this one-on-one visit is what residents are looking for. And again, these are results specific to Santa Fe and the study areas that we worked in here. But the general patterns do tend to play out in other places. And so just kind of expanding on that, as I was just saying, most of these results do tend to vary across different communities. And it's not always in totally predictable ways. And so one way to demonstrate that is by comparing answers to 2 types of questions that are included in the surveys. And so one type of question is the incentives, which I was just talking about. Those are the things that encourage people to do mitigation work. But the surveys also ask about barriers, just the things that stop the resident from conducting mitigation on their property. So it's just kind of the positive versus the negative framing, really. But the answers don't always line up the way you might necessarily expect them to. So here I want to show the most commonly selected response for 2 questions, for these 2 questions across 3 different study areas. So in the first, in a study in Chaffee County, partnered with Colorado State Forest Service in 2019, we saw that the physical ability to do the work was the most common barrier for the residents there. Then when respondents were asked about things that would encourage them, they did say help doing the work. So that makes total intuitive sense. It's the incentive matches the highest barrier. But in the Grand County study that I mentioned earlier, physical work is again noted as the most common barrier. But when asked about things that would encourage the work, residents there, they weren't saying physical help doing the work. The most common was actually specific information about what to do on their property. And this was actually about 4 out of every 5 residents there respondents there said that this is something that would encourage them. So again, this demonstrated desire for that parcel level information, that detailed information that the experts can really provide. And then finally, in the third study that I'm showing here, conducted in Platte Canyon, money is seen as the most common barrier. And yet, even though it's included in the list of potential incentives that people could select from, specific information was still the most popular incentive, not financial assistance programs. So of course, there's a lot of reasons that local organizations will focus on grant programs and put a lot of effort into them. And they do play a very important role in fulfilling a need for some homeowners. But when you look at the broader populations of the areas where we've been working, that often doesn't rise a lot. The top of the list of the things that would encourage people. And so this focused, targeted information that local professionals can provide really seems to be something that consistently comes to the top of the pile is in terms of things that would encourage mitigation on private property. So the surveys also ask about sources of information where people learn about wildfire risk or what they can do about it. And so this slide reports distributions of results across 9 different recent study areas. So different locations across the Western US, but aggregating it just to show the distribution. So these are box and whisker graphs. So within one of the colors, you're seeing where the bulk of the average responses from the different studies lie. So this first graph shows the percentage of respondents reporting receiving information about reducing wildfire risk from a given source across these 9 different studies. Results definitely vary across the studies, but local fire department, community groups such as an HOA, and media, general media, things like TV, radio, newspaper, are consistently found as among the most common and typically reported by well over half of respondents in a given study area. The studies also ask these same respondents, if you've received this information from a source, how useful was that information to you? Interestingly, the results do not generally vary as much across different study sites as the graph on the left. Local fire department is consistently rated as most useful. Firewise USA and US Forest Service rate fairly well, even though they're less commonly reported. So the people who are reached by these mechanisms tend to say this information that they got was useful. But perhaps most notably, although media is often reported as a source that a lot of people get information about wildfire risk from, few respondents rate that information as useful. And that result, as you can see by the thinness of that little bar there, has been pretty consistent across the 9 different study areas where we ask these types of questions. So surveys also ask about channels of information for getting information about wildfire risk. And so this slide again reports distribution results across these same 9 different studies. And here again, we see clear patterns despite variations across these studies in the preferred channels for receiving information about wildfire. And so to the extent that you can generalize these data, you see newsletters, more personalized interactions, whether they're in person or through community meetings. These things tend to be the most preferred. Somewhat surprisingly, to me at least, is that over there on the far right of the screen, social media very consistently are coming in at the bottom of the list in terms of the proportion of residents that prefer to receive information about wildfire from it. So this is just an important note to keep in mind. Just because there's a new technology, a new way to get messages out, doesn't mean that that's where residents are wanting to get information. Because again, this question, the question underlying these data is about how people say they want to get the information, not where they currently are. And so they are saying they prefer that more detailed newsletter format, typically preferred in email, but also just in old-fashioned mailed newsletters is a commonly expressed preference that residents would like that. So now, in the final section of my talk, I'm going to shift gears a bit more once again, and want to go to a bit higher level to just talk about how we as a team put this all together. And so what I'm showing right now is the core of kind of the data collection approach, where we have the properties that are assessed with the rapid assessment and the homeowners who received and returned the survey, and then those two combined provide the paired data that is used for analysis. And I like to describe the broader effort as really having 3 main areas of work. One is supporting the local organizations in working to reduce parcel level risk. The second is in working to understand residents' decisions about wildfire risk, and that's more broadly, and that's where we contribute more to the academic literature and do our econometric models or sociology work. And then the third is developing and testing evidence-based outreach or engagement programs. So I'll walk through each of these just briefly to provide a quick example. So for the supporting local organizations, this is something that having the nonprofit Wildfire Research Center as part of this team has really been able to move this side of the effort forward. And so there's a standardized list of different products that are provided to the partners throughout the process of the project. These include the data collection instruments, using computer-based tools for doing the rapid assessment, the household survey itself, result summaries, data sets, presentations, and a final report. So the general list is standardized, but it's also important that the content and the details of these are very customized for the specific partner needs and interests. And so how these things manifest, there's always a variety of different types of community meetings, depending on which groups the local partner wants to meet with. So this picture on the bottom left is showing a community meeting at the firehouse. Later today, I'm meeting with the mayor of Santa Fe. It just totally depends on the partner or the stakeholders that our partner is trying to get this information to. And so we can customize the message and pull different pieces of interesting information from the localized data collection that really tries to get at what these different stakeholders need in terms of being able to make decisions to reduce wildfire risk in their areas. As I mentioned, every study has a formal data report that's published as a Rocky Mountain Research Station research note, and that just summarizes the entirety of the data collected. Where the local partner wants it, we publish or provide the information for them to publish of the individual property level assessments. Some partners want to do that. Others definitely want that behind the scenes, not something that the public would ever see. Again, it totally depends. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. The local context, the culture, but also just the partner themselves too. And so these are important things that are customized throughout this process to meet the partner where they are. And then the final graphic here on the top right is showing something that we've been working on developing in the last year or two, is these customized mailers that go back out to the residents who were involved in the study. And they hit some of the high points, the high findings from the results. So it's very common that we see that homeowners are underestimating their risk compared to what the professionals were estimating the risk as. And so that information is often provided. But then we also will organize the information based on, for example, those barriers that I was discussing a few slides ago. What are the most commonly felt barriers that people see? And then we match these to the programs that are in development or already being run by the local partners. Because often the partners have these programs in place. It's just the information is not getting out to the homeowners necessarily, or it's not coming to them at a time when they want that information. And so these mailers are something we're working on as a way to really turn around and get this information back to the communities. Another thing we've been working recently is we've been fostering a WIRI partner community of practice. And this has been really exciting, particularly for folks like me, who I'm a researcher at a federal agency, like a lot of you on the call, I know. And we like to think about the impacts that our work is having on the ground. We try to think about how it can interface with decisions, but the opportunities that we get from having this type of a mechanism are pretty amazing, because what this community of practice is all the different partners who have been involved in WIRI studies over the years. They come and attend this, and they're happening quarterly, and there's a focused topic that's going to be that's developed around the idea of the usefulness of our data. What could we be doing better in terms of products? Or also, how did you confront this problem? Did you use volunteers in your study area? How did that work? So all across from process to content, the group gets together and discusses these things. And this has become a really interesting and valuable channel for having these discussions, and hopefully is a way to do a lot of that lateral learning across different study areas on what they've learned in terms of best practices, not just from the specific data, but also in turn developing a culture of evidence-based decision-making within their organizations, which is something that often comes out of the result of going through this process here. Another example, and I apologize a little bit about the shotgun style approach, but I just want to show the breadth of different things that we do. And this one I think is particularly important for this audience, is that we really work hard to make sure we're interfacing and collaborating with other organizations that are working in this space. So this graphic came out of conversations that we had in Grand County. As I mentioned when I was talking about the rapid assessment and the testing it with the East Troublesome Fire, after that fire, there was a lot of interest, and so Colorado Forest Restoration Institute was was doing a new landscape level risk assessment. Community wildfire mitigation best practices were being developed by the CMAT team. CPAW was there working with us, or working in the community. And we were able, because we already had the social data that was collected by the local partner, we were able to help them go into the community with a richer understanding of the way that the residents were thinking about wildfire before that fire happened. But again, thinking about that kind of baseline. What is it that people generally think about or understand when it comes to the wildfire here, and how might it, and that provides a baseline for how things might have changed. But the importance here, these are all different federally funded efforts, federally funded to different extents, that are all working in this space, and we find it really important to interface with these groups. And we found that having that local customized data for different partners is something that hopefully we can provide pretty good insights often. So next is the understanding residents' decisions about wildfire risks section. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I want to at least leave a few minutes for questions. Basically, want to note, we do put effort into publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. Frankly, not as much time and effort as we probably should, because that's an important part of how some of our research jobs are evaluated. But it really is paired on top of this working in the communities, because the research papers that we write, they're always informed through the conversations, and many of them are actually co-authored with the partners on the ground. And that's a true co-authorship. They help us interpret the findings, they help us develop the research questions. And so it really is a rich space to be working in as a researcher. One of the things we're working on developing in the overall project is collecting a kind of cohesive multi-site data set that goes across all the different studies to date. And so far there's 18 projects within this data set. And some of these most of these projects actually have more than one community within them. Like I was showing in the Santa Fe area, that would be one project, even though there's 8 communities within it that we're talking about. So there's almost 22,000 different records, including 6,600 of these have the paired data of surveys and assessments. And the data set keeps going. Keeps growing with each new study we do. If the partners are willing, and they always have been to date, their data get added into here, and it's something that we're just scratching the surface. And to that end, our team is hiring a postdoc, so we'd love if folks on this call are interested, or have people that they know, if you can share the information for that, because we're still in the process, or it's an open application right now. And obviously the folks on this call would be great candidates for something like that. It's a really rich data set, and we're excited to start doing more to dig deeper into some of the broader lessons that can be pulled from it. One thing that we're playing with in that area is we're trying to develop tools that will leverage the full data set for insights to specific areas. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's still work in progress. But an example here is, one of our partners, they had a community of 200 observations, and they were curious, do the data differ between part-time and full-time residents? And when we look at the data for that specific community, the 200, not a lot of statistical power, 34 out of 35 different variables that we looked at, no, there was no difference between full-time and part-time residents. If we look at the multi-site data set, we see 26 out of those same 35 variables actually do differ between part-time and full-time residents. These are two pretty contrary results. Obviously, there's more statistical power in the multi-site data set, but we don't know, or we're curious how that might apply. And so we're working on developing using a Bayesian modeling framework to use the master data set as developing the prior beliefs and the localized site-specific data to really tune the result to provide a combined result. And so when we merge these two data sets through this process, we see about half of the variables. And I'm not going into them in detail because I just wanted to talk about it at kind of the high level, but really this helps shape the conversations locally and helps recognize or acknowledge and accommodate that localized context while also pulling from the power of that large data set. And so again, I think there's a lot of potential here, and it's something that we're excited to keep working on more. So just the final section, and I promise I only have 1 or 2 more slides, but we ran a series of behavioral economics experiments about trying to get this information back out to homeowners and seeing how we could encourage encourage more interaction with the local partners through these. And so we did a series of experiments based around the idea of sending out mailers and seeing who would go to customized websites. And so the first one of these experiments demonstrated to us that where the study was, at least, providing information about the risk levels to encouraged information seeking for those residents who were rated in the higher risk levels. So those folks who might be more likely to want to go to your programs, they were encouraged by providing a quick snapshot of their parcel level risk. We also ran an experiment looking at the use of scary flames imagery versus like a very pleasant, happy image of that same community. And in this study, we found that using the flames imagery increased information seeking only for those with the lower access risk, but decreased the information seeking for those with the high levels of risk. So again, digging into developing information and data to provide evidence to inform the actual mailings that go out. Who are you trying to target with this? Is this the appropriate type of messaging to be bringing to this community? And we have one other that I'm not going to talk about because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. But you can see citations there, grab a screen grab, or follow up with me if you want to see any of these papers. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. I know I've covered a lot of ground, but I hope you've learned at least a little bit about how the WIRI team's paired parcel level risk and social data approach can support action on private land parcels, across parcels within a community, and across boundaries to nearby public land. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions and comments. If we don't have time to get to them all now, please don't hesitate to follow up with me. My email is there, and I can put it in the chat if desired. So thank you.
All right, thank you, James. We've had a number of questions in the chat that Hannah has been busily answering while you've been talking. So just for a really quick recap, Steve Ward asked about how research and recommendations can be incorporated into CWPPs, and Hannah mentioned that there are some variations within an area where CWPP prioritized fuel treatments are implemented and can inform the extent to which community engagement is needed. But in terms of actually incorporating directly into a written CWPP, the timing really has not kind of aligned to where the WIRI project implementation, the CWPP updates have been aligned to work, to mesh together, but working on that. Karen Short asked about and recommended that working with the reinsurance entities to leverage some of their high resolution home susceptibility data might be a good resource to add some of their data. Some good collaboration potential there.
Yeah, so I'll comment quick. I see Hannah did note that we've not used data from them, and I'll just note that there are questions in the surveys that ask about insurance, and one thing we generally find is that homeowners don't have a lot of, and this is changing, and very much we are seeing a change as more insurance industry is getting involved more closely. But traditionally what we've seen, or historically what we've seen, is that homeowners don't have a lot of understanding about the way their insurance works. So unless the insurance industry partners are interested in actually getting involved in, kind of the detailed hands-on providing the information, we don't know that that's going to really interface with this process so much. They have their risk models, which are important, and they do have some information that at times could be useful, but an important part of our process is kind of that standardization and getting the local practitioners, who tend to also be the people who go out on calls and also talk with the homeowners, getting them to look at the properties and say from their perspective what they see. So even when there's good secondary sources of data to draw from, it is really important. We think it's really important in this process to get the local partners to be involved in including collecting those rapid assessment data. But to your point, Karen, I think this is something that we really hope to see this go more, is thinking about leveraging these types of other or secondary data sources and how they can be incorporated not just at the community level, but can that type of information scale up, thinking about susceptibility of homes on the broader scale, risk modeling. So hopefully I didn't throw you off, Thomas, by
No, you're fine.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm glad. I really was hoping you would interject if you had anything to add to what Hannah had replied. Brianna Baker had asked if you looked at the preferences of how channels interact with the age of respondents, especially thinking about the preference away from social media, which Hannah said not yet, but probably should do that.
Not yet, probably should do that, but interesting to note, that result is one very consistent with what we saw here in Santa Fe, and the communities that we surveyed are definitely tend more towards the elderly populations. The average respondents were in the older. So, we might have a data support issue if we try to look at that, but it's still a very interesting and important point, and it goes to the broader argument that I'd say I'm making here is that thinking about the specific context of the specific community. So yeah, thank you for that point. Very good.
All right. Steve Orr then asked about it, whether you use a specific mobile app for performing the RAs, and Hannah replied that there is a Wire RA app, which is on ArcGIS field maps, that was built, and train your partners to use it and provide an assessor guide.
Yeah, and that's part of what has been wonderful over the past few years of having the nonprofit center that can really focus on providing the support for the local communities. It's built around developing these types of tools and then training them as part of the projects, because that's getting a little far afield from what us researchers could spend our time doing on a day-to-day basis. And so, yeah, the center's really working on building out those types of tools and answering the call. And this is, again, where that community practice has been useful to see where these tools are or aren't useful.
Taylor Smith asked if you had considered collaborating with partnerships in California, Oregon, and Nevada region that have the alert wildfire system to incorporate into your data studies.
We're always looking for new partners, to the extent that we can from a capacity, so certainly gaps on the map are not intentional. It's, historically we grew through kind of a word of mouth type thing. We try not to advertise because we already have more work than we can handle. But we're very interested in moving into different areas, always.
Yeah, Hannah had mentioned a partnership with the Ashland Fire Rescue in 2019 to 2020, and then Steve Orr added that there were several early detection vendors that are either getting into or hoping to get into the CO market.
And then that, again, it is something that we're seeing, there's definitely, I think the private market, venture capital, et cetera, is seeing the opportunity, given the scale of the wildfire crisis and the scale of the interest from the feds of addressing this. But we continue to feel that, as I said before, like having that local practitioner involvement is really important, and I think, yes, there can be some tools and things that, this is something that our group over the 12 years or so that we've been working together, we're continually iterating and working to incorporate these things in. So, we love hearing about new things, but at the same time, we do definitely privilege that, boots on the ground, tires on the roads type of approach.
Are there any other questions for James?
Or anything that folks want me to go back to, since I did kind of a rapid fire response. I wasn't sure how many questions we were looking at.
Well, seeing no additional questions, Patty Champ had put the contact info into the chat for everybody, emails for James, Hannah, and herself. So if you have any additional questions for the WIRE team, please feel free to reach out to them. James, again, I want to thank you for your presentation today. Next week, we will be continuing our series with Matt Thompson, who will be presenting on slack and scarcity in wildfire management, and it will be an online only presentation. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And as Audrey has put up, you can go to our website, firelab.org, and see our seminar schedule. And if you have any ideas, please reach out to Chris Stalling at christinestalling.stalling@usda.gov. So again, James, thank you. And everybody, thank you for attending today. And hopefully we'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you, everybody.